Please welcome to the stage President of the Eurasia Group, Dr. Ian Bremmer.
Thank you very much, and welcome. My warm congratulations to Nick and Matt, and to be back here at the Concordia Summit. The schedule looks fantastic, and I'm honored to be able to play a role in kicking it off. The United Nations Week, you saw President Obama give his speech as plenary last week. One of the things he talked about was if President Putin were allowed to continue with his militarist threat in Ukraine, that the world order itself, the fabric of the world order, was under threat, and it must not be allowed to stand. Now, you have a panel directly after me which is going to be more than happy to address their irritation collectively with the Russian president. You've got Georgia, you've got Poland, you've got Latvia, and you have Senator McCain. I mean, that's a good group for that. And I, by the way, I agree with the statement. There's no question. But I want to say more broadly that there are some bigger challenges to the world order today, each of which are, I would say, more difficult, more intractable to respond to even than the extremely conflictual situation we have in Ukraine. Three I can think of. Number one, the United States. We do not want to play the global role that we have historically. And yes, some of that is President Obama's unwillingness to be strategic and take big risks on foreign policy, particularly with a weak second-term team, some of it. But some of it is the unwillingness to return to war after very challenging and unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of it is a growing gap between rich and poor, and the feeling that a majority of Americans don't benefit from either Americanization or globalization around the world. Some of it is the energy revolution and the notion that all of these geopolitical conflicts are someone else's bigger problem than they are those of the United States. Put all of those together, I don't care who you get in 2016, this is a structural challenge. A second point, America's allies, much more diffuse and divergent in their interests in supporting U.S. policy, in harmonizing U.S. security policy or diplomatic efforts around the world than they have been historically. And sure, some of that is a response to the NSA and Snowden, and some of that is a response to American unilateral sanctions against European banks, $10 billion fine against Bank Paribas. Some of that is the fact that the Brits have just had to deal with their own internal challenges and have an EU referendum coming up. Just yesterday, Prime Minister Cameron saying that he might have to actively campaign in favor of leaving the Union if they can't work out the nature of their agreement with the European Union states. Some of that, the fact that Germany is in the lead of Europe today with a dramatically different perspective towards the US, towards global geopolitics than the Brits or than the French. That's a challenge. And then the third point is that emerging markets around the world are becoming more influential, more powerful. They're a larger piece of the global economy. They don't want to be global leaders, but they absolutely have strong preferences in the way that leadership should exist in their own backyards. And I'm not just talking about Russia. I'm not just talking about India, of course, or Turkey. I'm talking about Brazil. I'm talking about China, which is soon to be the world's largest economy, and which is not an enemy of the United States, but is surely not an ally, and has very different perspectives on how the world should be run. So yes, we enter the United Nations General Assembly Week with the world community here together. Never has the importance of the world community getting together on one stage seemed more important or more critical, and yet never has it seemed in recent times so challenging and so urgent. So that's the first point. I don't think this is all about how do we respond to Russia. I think we have to look at ourselves. Every one of us, we're a part of this leadership challenge. The second thing I wanted to talk about to open this meeting is the challenges that are being faced by central government. Everywhere we look around the world, central government doesn't seem to be governing well. You look in Washington and you ask, what is moving in terms of legislation? That leadership gap is not just in the presidency, it's across the board once you get into the Beltway. And it's not just the United States. Look, Britain just dodged a bullet in terms of Scotland saying they wanted out. Secessionist movements across Europe these days. In Hong Kong, we have Occupy Central over the weekend, now becoming Occupy Hong Kong, as those demonstrations spread across the island in demands for their own more autonomous and more democratic governance from that of Beijing. Even in the United States, a survey taken last week said 25% of Americans would like their state to secede from the Union if the opportunity was afforded them, which clearly teaches us we should not be offering Americans hypotheticals and polls. That's just a bad thing to do. What I find very interesting about all of this threat of the state, if I were Frank Fukuyama, I might write a book, say The End of the State, as opposed to The End of History. But it's not the end of the state. What's so interesting is the response to the challenge of central government is dramatically different around the world. In advanced industrial democracies and in consolidated democracies among emerging markets, the response is decentralization. The response is power in the hands of smaller communities. I know we're not governing well in Washington, but look at what we're doing on immigration or energy. Look at what we're doing on same-sex marriage. Look at what we're doing on investment in from China. Look at all of the policies that are moving at municipal levels and at state levels. Following the difficulty between Britain and Scotland, the vote was no, but you're going to see power decentralized to the Scots. Fiscal policy, tax policy, budgetary authority is going to clearly be more effective over time as a consequence of the push and pull between center and periphery. This isn't just happening in developed states. You look at India, you look at Indonesia, new leaders who have been strong and successful in governing regions, successful regions economically, and creating transparency and more economic reform. So you can say, wow, that's great. The flexibility of states in finding a way to govern and respond effectively to their constituents when central government seems to be all bunged up. And yet, authoritarian states are responding in exactly the opposite way. You can't look at Russia and tell me that their response to the challenges of central governments has been decentralization. It's been centralization in the hands of one person. There's real economic reform happening in China. Yes, there is. But there's also centralization and consolidation of power in the hands of the Leadership Council and Xi Jinping. I look at the Gulf Cooperation Council. I look at the Saudis. I look at Bahrain. I look at Kuwait. I look at the UAE. I see the same thing happening. And those countries they're supporting, look at Egypt under Sisi. Not only more consolidated than following the Arab Spring with the Muslim Brotherhood, but maybe even more consolidated than under Mubarak before the whole thing happened. And then a third group of states, those that are not consolidated democracies and are not authoritarian regimes with the resources to actually bring power into their hands. And in those countries, we see fragmentation. We see pieces of their countries no longer able to be functionally governed. And we see that in Yemen, we see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Pakistan. We see it in Libya, we see it in Syria, we see it in Iraq, we see it in northern Nigeria. So the same set of challenges becoming much more hard to deal with in different places. The reason I mention all of this is not because it's the end of the state, but because central governments are going to have a harder time cooperating across the aisle at a time when it's increasingly critical, because the responses are increasingly diffuse and disparate. Why are we here for Concordia? Because the need for flexible modes of cooperation between states and non-state actors has never been greater. That's precisely what Nick and Matt and this entire group bring together. I'm delighted to be able to be a part of it, and I know that everyone is going to be very excited about this illustrious panel that follows me in just about 10 seconds. Thank you very much. Please welcome them.